Thank you for joining us today. My name is Tariq Isa, and I'm honored to be your moderator for today. I actually have over 11 years of experience in consulting and finance across the energy sector, and so our topic for today is very close to my heart. Welcome again to Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week web series. Sustainable finance plays an important role in supporting nations and organizations as they work for their net zero goals by 2050. Significant investment is required and projects need to remain profitable as the sector looks to attract new investors. I am honored to be joined by a fantastic group of financial industry experts to discuss what are some of the barriers the sector faces and how can we attract new sources of capital. I would like to introduce my panelists today. First, I would like to welcome Shargil Bashir, Chief Sustainability Officer and Head of Corporate Governance at FAB. Second, I have with me Oliver Phillips, Associate Director, Sustainable Finance Standard and Charter. And third, I'm joined by Roderick Pierce, Senior Head of Industry Research at CFA Institute. I would let each one of them briefly introduce themselves as we go through our questions. So, as we know, COP26 accomplished several of its objectives, but also seen as lacking in specific targets. So, first question I would like to address to Shargil: what can we learn from COP regarding what is happening in the world of sustainable finance?
Thank you, Tariq, and thank you very much for having me as part of this panel. I think COP26 was interesting in many different ways. Some of the key takeaways from myself and for the financial industry specifically, I think that this was the COP where we had the largest participation from the private sector, which is extremely important. I think that the private sector needs to be part of the discussion on climate change. I think it's very important. So I was very happy to see the large participation, and the solutions that came out of COP26 was both addressing and getting commitments from the private sector as well as from the government and the public sector as well. The second part I will say that was extremely important, which I was personally very happy to see, was the introduction of the International Sustainability Standards Board, which was introduced by IFRS. This is basically to ensure that we get some common disclosures, we get some minimum requirements that what is required when we discuss sustainability, sustainable finance. What are the requirements that everybody will need to disclose going forward? Transparency is extremely important when we are discussing sustainable financing, when we are discussing sustainability or ESG in general. So it was extremely important that is an initiative that has come out at COP26, and I'm really looking forward to following this going forward. And final thing I would say as well is that we saw at this COP commitments, very concrete commitments from some countries, as an example on coal, exiting the coal as industry, which was very important, not specifically because of coal, but getting commitments and showing actions from governments are going to be extremely important going forward in order to focus on what will be extremely important from the transition that needs to happen going forward. So for me, that was the extremely important part. We are seeing more and more commitments coming from governments. We are seeing commitment coming from the private sector on net zero commitments. And it will be extremely important from now on in the coming year to see how do these commitments materialize? What kind of strategies, what kind of roadmaps are we going to see coming out in order to ensure that we can live up to the commitments of net zero? So those were some of the takeaways I had from COP26, and which is going to be followed up hopefully at the COP27 and COP28 as well.
Thank you very much. That was very insightful. Next, I would like to hear Oliver's view, and of course, same thing, same question. What can we learn, and what can we discuss moving forward?
Yeah, thank you, Tarek, and thank you to Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week for organising this webinar. It's great to be speaking with you all today. I think I'll echo Shargil's sort of overall comment. COP26 was positive. I think that's the key takeaway. After a couple of years of potentially sort of disappointing COPs, I think there's probably had more good that came out of it than the last couple, which is obviously a good thing. On my side, I think that among those positives, the global methane pledge, I think very important, seeing that not just the focus on carbon, but the sort of the wider kind of gamut of greenhouse gases. I think that's good to see that that's sort of been taken into account. I definitely echo Shargil on the ISSB. I think the importance of the harmonization of ESG reporting, which is something that is actually at the moment quite fragmented, and there's lots of different people looking at different things in a slightly different way, which doesn't help anyone actually when they're trying to report. So I think that the creation, the foundation of the ISSB is a really good step on that side. And I think also seeing greater commitments from the private sector in particular, but particularly the financial sector as a sort of subset of that. And I think really sort of positive to see that there are a lot of announcements pre-COP. Standard Chartered, for example, came out with our net zero strategy, but we've seen other banks continue sort of post-COP to build on that momentum and release their own strategies. So also a good thing on that side. Now, most importantly for me really has to be the developments around Article 6 and what that kind of puts in place for a global carbon market, as this is an area that I think we may come on to a little bit later in this webinar, but for me is a really important topic and a really powerful tool that if we get it right and set up a carbon market properly, can move the needle in a way that I don't think there are many other things that can, to be honest, when it comes to the world of sustainable finance. But there is a downside for me. The one downside is that there really still isn't enough talk and enough action, actually, I suppose, rather than talk. And I think that's the key thing, action, in supporting the least developed markets. So whatever figures you look at point to the fact that the climate, and to be honest, not just climate, but the wider SDGs, are massively underfunded in emerging markets, particularly the least developed of those emerging markets. And Africa, I look after the Africa region as well as the Middle East and Pakistan at Standard Chartered. Africa is probably the furthest behind when it comes to that. So in terms of what do I want to see from COP27, I think that's clearly the key area of focus. Really looking at how can you translate all the good things that are happening at the moment, and there's plenty of good that is happening, but make sure you're translating that and providing opportunities for those least developed markets. And I think Egypt as the host of COP27, and then actually the UAE as well for COP28, are uniquely placed for this. Both are a natural bridge to Africa for developing markets, for developed markets to sort of be bridged into Africa. And UAE kind of has that double role as a sort of the bridge into emerging Asia as well. So I think for both of those, it's going to make a lot of sense to focus on this, and I think that's where the international community definitely needs to be investing some of its efforts. The final thing I still think we need more progress on, and it's one of my other negatives from COP, was the final watering down of the language around coal. And Shargil, you've picked up on this, but I think we had a phase down rather than a phase out. And I think that's the key thing I think we do need to see is, it's a good step, it's a positive step, but moving towards that proper phase out and seeing countries continue to set more and more ambitious targets around the decarbonisation of their power system is going to be really important.
Thank you very much, Oliver. Rode, also would like to hear your view on this, especially with your industry research part. Can we hear your view?
Sure. Thank you, Tarek, and thanks also to Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week for inviting me to participate in this panel. It's a pleasure to be here today. Maybe just to start off, to provide some more general reflections on COP26. I think one of the things that I took away was that it really provided more impetus and urgency to tackling climate change risks, and that we see that there is now this sort of collective political buy-in to the imperative of the need for action. And that signaling effect really should accelerate the flow of public and private capital into sustainable investments. And I think what's most important now going forward, my panelists have talked about the commitments made. We really need to see those commitments translate into actions That's really going to be the key yardstick by which the success of future COP27, COP28, and so forth will be judged. If I sort of take a step back slightly and now sort of focus in a bit more on the implications for the investment industry and looking at this through the lens of an investor, if we can start from the premise that there is now this widespread acceptance that climate-related risks are real and can have material long-term impacts on portfolios, the question, I think, for investment firms is then how do you adapt your strategy, your business model, your investment processes to account for these risks, but also to position for the opportunities that will arise from this transition to a lower carbon economy in the future. So I think the key point here is just understanding the importance of taking a long-term view, as climate change will be material, but will not necessarily manifest itself in portfolios in the short term. And this is the concept that Mark Carney commonly refers to as the tragedy of the horizons. So the consideration really for firms should be, how does climate change play into the business model? How does it play into investment processes? That really involves businesses taking a look at sustainability considerations throughout the business, including governance, thinking about the development of new products and strategies. Client reporting and disclosures massively need to improve. We saw some advances there in COP26, and as Shargil referred to, the creation of the International Sustainability Standards Board is obviously a positive that can hopefully unite what really is quite a fragmented corporate reporting and financial reporting landscape. If we then sort of think a bit more about data, I think that also is another key area where more work is needed to be done to enable the investment industry to better take account of climate-related risks going forward. We know lack of measurement tools is a barrier. I think Oliver referred to the carbon markets. I think that is an area that is ripe for further development. If we can develop these markets, have a reliable carbon pricing mechanism, that would massively improve the ability of investors to factor in certain carbon scenarios into portfolios and investment decisions going forward. We also need better benchmarks as well. This will help professionals, portfolio managers better evaluate the performance from portfolios that are positioned to mitigate climate risks or to benefit from those climate transition opportunities. So certainly there are some areas there for development, certainly around data, certainly around standards, the development of carbon markets, and above all, I think translating these commitments into actions for future COP summits.
Okay, thank you very much. Next, I would like to talk about new developments in project finance, and I would like to address my first question to Shargil. If we're looking at new development and ways to finance projects, how can we make projects more bankable?
Thanks, Tariq, for the question. I think if we just take a step back and just discuss what is bankable, I think the understandable of a bankable project has probably developed also over the past years. If we look some years back, it was just important in order to make a project bankable from a sustainable finance perspective was, what are you going to use the proceeds for? Did it link into the sustainable development goal somehow, which was a very important part of it. And I think it still is key. But if you look at the future down the road, already now and probably in a couple of years' time, what I think is going to be extremely important is that do you have the strategy which is supporting the projects? So I think that until now, we have been looking at products at standalone basis and say, how do they fit in? Are they profitable? Are they supporting the right sustainable goals and able to help them achieve them? I think that we will need to now see that whether these are corporates, whether these are governments, need to have a climate change strategy. When that strategy is in place, you will then need to look at that this specific project, how is this project going to support that strategy? How is the roadmap developed? This specific project, what will this contribute to? And then I think that we will need to look away from a sustainable financing, instead of thinking on the typical and standard way from a return of investment perspective. We will need to look into that returns in a climate perspective is not only the monetized return you'll be getting, but also how is this going to impact the climate itself. So when you are looking into a specific project, instead of thinking about the return on investment from a monetized perspective, you will need to look into what impact will this project have from an emissions perspective. So how much reduction of emission is going to happen? So I think that in order to make the projects more bankable, you need to fit them into your climate change strategy, first of all. So I think that the time of having isolated projects itself is probably going to move away in the coming years, but you will need to look into that, whether you have a net zero strategy, whether you have a climate change strategy, what is your roadmap? How are you going to meet those targets? How will this specific project fit into your strategy, to your roadmap? And what kind of impact will this specific project have? Will it help it reduce your emissions by 20%, 30%? What kind of impact will that have? And I think that is going to be extremely important. And then, of course, I think that we will get, over time, we will start getting a common taxonomy, hopefully a more a common sustainable finance framework internationally, hopefully, which will also give more guidance to corporates to say, what is it that they need to look into. But I do think that we need to look at bankable projects from more of a strategic perspective instead of just looking from a standalone perspective. Because on one hand, you can finance a very good sustainable project, but on the other hand, you might also be financing something which is not very good from a climate change perspective. And I think that we need to link this much more in line and look at it from a strategic perspective and say, how will this overall impact the climate change?
Okay, thank you very much. Next, if we talk about the new finance products, so how do we finance these projects? How do we attract new sources of capital? Oliver, I would like to address this question to you.
Yeah, thanks, Tarek. I think just first, I really want to echo what Shargil's saying about understanding the impact of these projects and bringing that into how you assess them. I think it's something that we as a bank, and I know many others like Fab as well, are starting to do, and I think that's really going to be a game changer. So just wanted to kind of echo those points. Is something that I firmly believe in as well. But looking at how do we actually fund these things, I think one thing that's, to be honest, not new but still very relevant and possibly not utilized enough is blended finance. So this is bringing development capital alongside commercial capital, and using that development capital to de-risk the structure so that it becomes more appealing for commercial capital. Now, I think one of the challenges is that so this blended finance stuff, we quite often see a one-off deal. We see a great transaction. It's got the public-private side to it. It ticks all the boxes, but then nothing else happens as a follow-up. And this is one of the things that I've spoken about in other forums before, but I think is a real challenge, and that unlocking this will be a really important tool for the finance industry. Is that you need to look at this as a journey. So you need to look at how can basically the development capital start bringing in the commercial capital gradually over time at greater scales. So you start off with one transaction where the commercial bank comes in for 5% of the total ticket size. The next one is similar technology, similar sort of project. You try and get the commercial banking capital to go up to 15%. And then building on that, because really that's the role of development capital. It's to drive that sort of additionality in these projects and to bring along the commercial capital so that they can then move on to the next range of technology, the newest things, whether it's a brand new innovative technology we've not seen before, or it's a new market that we're not seeing the sort of the amount of capital starting to flow. So I think that role of blended finance is really important, to bringing in those new sources, to bringing in the commercial capital into the mix as well. I think beyond that, though, we need to be a bit more creative around how we start to look at these projects and how we start to risk mitigate them. And obviously, the role of a development bank coming in does kind of de-risk it for a commercial bank, but also thinking about what else can you do. And the one thing that I think for sustainable projects in emerging markets in particular is really key is using export credit agencies. So these are typically kind of a government institution that comes in and provides some sort of risk mitigation on the project linked to the underlying goods coming from the government that export credit agency is part of. And it's something that at Standard Chartered we are doing a lot of, and we see a lot of benefit in. And just this, just in the last year, or in fact last 6 months, to be honest, we've done two, not green on this side, but social loans for a project in Ghana and a project in Senegal, which use an ECA wrapper in there to basically kind of get that funding and fund some really important projects on the ground. They're going to have a massive social impact in both of those markets. Now, I mentioned this in my answer to the first question, so I think now's the good time to bring this up. But for me, the kind of the really new and exciting way that I think is going to make a big difference is carbon financing. So carbon financing effectively is, you finance a project, that project reduces or removes, X amount of carbon. You using a methodology, and it's an independent methodology that you have to then get kind of verified. You create a number of carbon credits from that project, and you can then sell those carbon credits. What that does is it brings in a new source of cash flow to the project. So not only do you have your financial returns from the project, but you also have this extra bit from the carbon, which if you're a credit officer at a bank looking at it, it's another bit of kind of sort of comfort and assurance you can get that you're going to be paid back. But actually, what's interesting is not just that. What's interesting is what it opens things up for. So if you look at, for example, a project where from day one you can generate a lot of carbon credits. So let's say it's a planned sustainable land use of an area. Instead of allowing trees to be deforested, you're stopping them from being cut down and kind of using the land more sustainably. Day one, you will be generating carbon credits. Now, day one, you wouldn't necessarily have the sort of the economics of the underlying businesses that might be part of that, that would allow you to get the funding that you might otherwise. But you can actually structure the funding on the basis of the sale of those carbon credits. And that allows you to then fund these projects, which often we sort of talk about in the carbon credits world, have co-benefits. So it's not just the climate of the fact that you're not deforesting trees, you're planting new ones, you're using the land more sustainably, and you're therefore kind of reducing your carbon impact of it. But there's also associated social benefits that go alongside. So that's a really kind of interesting area, and it's something that as the bank we're very keen on, and we're trying to push ourselves to be at the forefront of this. The Task Force on Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets, which Mark Carney kind of initiated, our group CEO Bill Winters chaired last year, and that's now moved into the second phase, which again we're sort of on the kind of the advisory board for, and sort of really trying to push that as a way for the private sector to develop its own playbook for using carbon credits and carbon financing, and also starting something in Singapore called Climate Impact X, which is a sort of carbon exchange that would allow people to kind of identify these projects more easily. And as more and more companies set their net zero goals, which will include an element of carbon offsetting, which obviously you do through carbon credits, those sorts of things are going to become more and more important. So I think carbon financing is going to be a really interesting way and a really exciting way to fund some of these projects that we weren't able to fund before, or to fund them at terms that actually make more sense and allow those projects to be even more successful.
Okay, thank you very much, Oliver. Rodri, next question for you. I think a lot of finance professionals these days think about it. So what are the skills finance professionals will need to acquire to be more professional in sustainability? Next is how much upskilling is needed, and what is the state of the talent gap currently in the market?
Yeah, thanks, Tarek. So obviously the skills is a key area. Financial professionals need to be competent, literate, and up to speed with the knowledge and the skills in the sustainability space. And really, we see it as finance professionals needing a mixture of skills, because sustainability is a multidisciplinary subject. If I can sort of decompose those skills a little bit, firstly, starting off with quantitative skills, professionals obviously need to be able to identify material ESG data points and incorporate those into their analysis. So they need to be able to work with a variety of data to do that, including traditional ESG metrics, as well as corporate reporting data, but also alternative data as well, because sustainability is a topic, it's really subjective and contextual. And so knowing which data points are material to your investment analysis, which data points are valid, and then to work with those data points accordingly in building out your recommendations and your investment decisions accordingly. So aside from the quantitative skills, I think professionals also need good soft skills. So, for example, they need to be able to understand the context of sustainability within a given investment proposition. And importantly, they need to be able to ask those difficult questions of company management and to be able to communicate well so that others in the investment team can understand the relevance and the investment merits of a particular sustainability issue. So really having that a good mixture of soft skills with good quantitative skills and the ability to work with a variety of data sources, areas that we see as important for the future, and probably all areas that current investment professionals will need to do some upskilling to stay current as sustainability becomes more mainstream through the investment business. Second part of your question, I think you asked about the talent gap. So we actually conducted some analysis on this within CFA Institute, and we partnered with LinkedIn Talent Insights. And in short, we found that the supply of sustainability expertise among core investment roles is fairly limited at the moment, but growing quickly. So we looked at around 1 million different investment job profiles on LinkedIn and found that just under 1% of those actually listed sustainability as an area of expertise in the job profile, but that number had increased 26% over 1 year. So starting from a relatively small base, but we see a lot of growth in professionals listing sustainability in their areas of expertise. On the other side of the talent equation is the demand for skills in this space, and we do see strong demand. If you look, for example, at portfolio manager job postings in LinkedIn, we found that almost 1/5 of those job advertisements were listing ESG as a desired skill. So there's high demand for it, relatively low supply, albeit that the supply in the talent pipeline is quickly catching up to demand. Now, how does that gap get closed even further over time? I think training is part of the issue. We do see that ESG training has increased in the past few years, but in a recent survey we conducted, fewer than half of respondents said that their firm provides ESG training. And in fact, just 11% of investment professionals currently consider themselves proficient in the ESG area, but more than 70% have interest in ESG training. So we think the training will be accomplished through a mixture of formal courses, learning on the job. We've seen a number of organizations recently create courses and certificates in ESG investing. CFA Institute is one of those providers. We have our own certificate now in ESG investing to equip a variety of professionals with the core skills and competencies they need to be effective in operating in the sustainability area. So lots happening in the sort of the talent development space. But upskilling will be a sort of a regular requirement, we think, for financial professionals to stay current and to be effective in their roles going forward.
Thank you very much, Rodri. Next, our third question for today is the role of capital in developing and assisting governments to make and meet net zero commitments. One part of it, I would like to ask, how can we avoid greenwashing and who should be taking the accountability of it? I would like to first address this to Shargil, please.
So if we start with the first part of the question, Tariq, regarding the importance of capital in developing countries, I think overall capital is going to play a crucial role in order to achieve the challenges we are having with the climate change journey we are all on at this point. And that is important whether you're a part of a developing country or not. I think that the financial sector, as I think Oliver mentioned previously, is going to be a key part and stakeholder for us to support on the transition towards net zero. I think that the financial sector needs to take that responsibility to finance that transition. We are doing this at the FAB, Standard Chartered is doing, a lot of banks are doing this. I think this is a core thing. We're going to see more and more of this going forward. Another thing which is important from a developing country perspective is also private and public partnerships are going to be extremely important. I think that in the developing countries, there needs to be a very strong collaboration between the private sector and the public sector in order to achieve the challenges to the climate change. Because there are many challenges linked to climate change as well, which needs to be addressed in the developing countries. A lot of the challenges from the Sustainable Development Goals needs to be addressed, and this is not something that the public sector can do by themselves. There needs to be a lot of support from the private sector as well, and that's why I think that we're going to see many more partnerships coming through. We already saw at the COP26 that a lot of partnerships came out of that. I think we're going to see many more coming towards COP27 and COP28 in order to achieve those targets. In regards to greenwashing, I think greenwashing is an extremely important discussion we need to have. I think if we just break this up, I think that greenwashing is, first of all, two things, because greenwashing can happen by intention, which is a big challenge, which we need to address, but it could also happen unintentionally. And the reason it happens unintentionally is that right now, we all want to have transparency when we are discussing climate change. However, we don't have a common understanding, a common standards of what is good and what is bad when it comes to climate change. Because a lot of people do not understand the details of the challenge we are seeing, as an example, with sustainable financing, as we are seeing with the challenges with the climate change. That's why, as we mentioned before, the common standards for disclosure is going to be extremely important, because people might have the good intentions to become more transparent, or say, they're doing these different initiatives with a good intention. However, it is just not acceptable from the receiver's point of view. So I think it's very important that we divide this, right? And today, everything might be greenwashing, and I fully agree on that, but some things is being done from an intentionally perspective, and some things are being done because we all ask for transparency. However, we don't have common standards, so you get judged on sometimes subjective viewpoints on this as well. But the responsibility will always lie with the people who are, everybody will need to be transparent here, right? So I think the responsibility here is for everybody who's communicating on these things and taking the ownership. So whoever the corporates, the customers, everything will need to be very transparent that why are they doing this? What is their intention? And only then, and how does this fit into the strategy, right? For the first point I made, that if you have the overall strategy and you can say that we are doing this because it's part of our roadmap, it's part of our strategy, then you are showing the transparency that why you have taken the actions you have taken. And then people will decide whether it was the right thing to do or not. Today we are in, because we don't have some common standards, everybody can judge someone on these things, whether they believe this is greenwashing or not. So I think that is the challenge, at least as I see it right now, that you judge people on some subjective criteria at this point.
Okay, thank you very much. That was very insightful. Oliver, I would like to repeat the same question for you. Maybe if you have anything to add on this, love to hear your point.
Yeah, thanks, Tarek. I think what Shargil said at the start of his answer there is really kind of crucial. Access to capital is the most important thing for any country, whether you're a developed market or a developing market, or one of the least developed markets in the world, when it comes to meeting your net zero goals, because all of these things are going to come at significant costs, and governments need to find a way to do that, and there's obviously other challenges around their funding that they have to look at. How do you balance taxation, for example, as a way to deliver it? But I think in developing markets, this is probably even more of a challenge because you have to balance sustainable development with social development. So what I mean by that is it's relatively easier for someone in Europe or even the UAE to talk about, for example, greening your electricity supply, moving to renewables when electrification rates are already quite high. But imagine if you are a government in somewhere like the Gambia, for example, where you're not going to a green energy supply is a long way from you. Actually, your focus at the moment is just a general electricity supply, making sure that you can actually connect people and give them sort of access to the basic resources that they need. So it's obviously a very different story for those markets. But I guess the good thing is that the sort of the green, the sustainable option actually presents a huge opportunity to leapfrog some of the legacy technology. We've seen with renewable energy markets that actually renewable energy now is to be honest, in most places more cost effective than fossil fuels. And also when you're looking at somewhere that you're effectively building a brand new grid, for example, you have a lot of capex associated with grid infrastructure. Not only do you need to build your power plant, but you need to build your kind of transmission lines. You then need to build your distribution stations and set up quite a lot of infrastructure. If you look at something like renewables, you can sort of leapfrog a lot of that and save on a lot of that by looking at off-grid solutions or microgrids, particularly when we're looking at markets that tend to be sort of in the less developed space. Anyway, you tend to be looking at a lot of the time, how do you address this challenge for rural populations, which is obviously more complicated than at times than a sort of urban population that you're looking to deal with. So I think for developing markets, that's where it really becomes important to get that sustainable capital, get those funds that are directly financing those projects that are going to really deliver on the impact that they need to, not just on electricity, but on things like water supply, pollution prevention, all of these other things that sort of come into play there. So at Standard Chartered, I mentioned we're looking at the sort of the ECA financing, the export credit agencies, and that's one thing we're doing a lot of for sustainable infrastructure project financing. So going and identifying with a government a particular project, a particular priority, and structuring something that goes towards that particular thing, and using sustainable finance as a tool to get that. If you structure it as a green loan or a social loan, you can help to sort of market it to a wider number of lenders. And we've also seen that potentially on the export credit agency side, there might be some sort of improved terms that you can get from them when you go looking for sort of a green project that you're financing rather than a non-green one. So that's obviously one thing, but I think what we also need to do is shift the capital that these entities, particularly governments in emerging markets, are getting from being conventional to sustainable. And obviously one of the sort of the largest areas of that is the bond market, and that's where so many emerging market sovereigns are particularly dependent on as a source for their financing for each year. And I think it's also an area where we see a lot of ability to be able to drive the flow of sustainable capital, because investors really are pushing for this, and they're focusing on this, and they're more and more interested in offering sustainable products to their investors, to you and me when we put our funds in sustainable investment products. And as Rodri mentioned, there's obviously a big drive from them in terms of getting the skills and getting the right people to be able to do that job, but they also need to have the investment opportunities that are actually out there. So what we've been doing is working with a lot of our clients, our sovereign clients in particular, to put together their sustainable finance frameworks, which is really the document that allows them to go out and access sustainable debt, whether that's a bond or even a loan as well. And obviously that means that rather than just looking at a single project, they can raise a much larger amount that's going to go towards lots of different projects at once, and it streamlines the whole process, simplifies the funding, and hopefully allows them to kind of deliver more and more impact. And I think this is not just important because when they're going, these issuers are going on a non-sustainable bond deal, they're seeing even more pressure from their investors to find out, what are you doing on the ESG front? What's your net zero commitment? What are your broader sustainability goals? What are you actually doing to be able to get there? So one really nice example that I kind of like talking about is the Republic of Ghana's Sustainable Finance Framework. And we recently supported them put this together, and they released it about a month or so ago for everyone to kind of look at, even though they haven't done a transaction around it yet. But that not only had the sustainable use of proceeds side, so had those projects, it said, if we raise X amount of money, we're going to put it to these sorts of projects, but also had what we call a sustainability linked component. And this is basically saying, well, if we don't meet certain ESG targets that we have set upfront at the time of the issuance, then there will be a financial penalty on us. And I think this is a really nice structure by having both bits together to help to drive that incentive that we need to get for these issuers to really go after these goals and to stretch themselves and to be ambitious. But at the same time, recognizing that you do need the funds, you need the capital to support them to be able to get there and to actually take those important steps on their journey. So moving on to the second part of your question, Tarek, around greenwashing, I think the short answer is we're all accountable. Everybody in some shape or form is going to be responsible for playing their part to addressing this. And I don't think any one can do it without the other. And I think that kind of goes to what Shaga was saying a little bit about the fact that we need to understand, what are we assessing greenwashing as? What are we looking at it? How are we looking at it? And how are we referencing things when we say this is greenwashing or this isn't greenwashing? But from a sort of simplistic point of view, if you're a company, you need to be ensuring that you're disclosing accurate data. You need to be transparent about it. And if you can align that into not just reporting a single data point in isolation that doesn't mean much, but a data point as part of a wider strategy, you then obviously have something that people can understand, that they can contextualize, which becomes much more powerful. So that's, companies can play that role. Investors, I think, as well, need to be pushing for the right standards, and they need to do so consistently. They can't be saying, one investor wants this, one investor wants that. I think, there needs to be some harmonization, and that's why I mentioned it in the first question. The International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSB, has been really important to give us a kind of a common reporting framework for ESG, so that people know what to look at and they know what to push for. But investors also need to be then, sort of held accountable for what they report to those who invest in them, because only by giving that transparency around what their funds are going towards are you then going to bring more and more capital in, which is going to kind of make sure that companies then say, okay, well, we know that people are supporting X, so we're going to make sure that we are doing this in the right way, and we're putting ourselves kind of in the position to be able to get access to that capital. There's obviously a role for regulators. I think that goes without saying. They need to be setting the standards. They need to be providing the proper groundwork as well. I think this is important. You can't just set the standards and then say, well, go out and do it. The regulators need to make sure they're providing that base and that platform for people to be able to apply them properly and in a way that actually brings value and doesn't just kind of leave everybody out to dry. And then I guess within all of that, I do see a role for banks in particular. And I think it's one that it's very important for us as banks to be kind of across, because we are across the different bits of this. On one side, we're structuring some of these transactions. We're actually structuring a sustainable bond. We need to make sure that we're pushing that to be set up in the right way, that you can have that comfort that there is greenwashing isn't happening, that there's verification of the structure, there's regular reporting, that reporting is done in the right way. So we obviously have a piece there, but then we're also an investor into these. We lend to these companies, we lend to these projects. So we need to be, if we can drive it on the structuring side, we can then take comfort as well when we're coming into them. And I think for me, there are sort of two things that banks should really try and push for in this bit. The first is going above and beyond the minimum requirements in terms of getting that external verification on something. So making sure that it's not just, you know, the bank and the client saying, well, this is green because we say it is, but if you can bring in an independent third party that says, actually, you know what, we've reviewed this, we've assessed it against a taxonomy, and we've got a reference point for this, then that's quite a powerful tool. We see this really clearly in the bond market, but not so much yet in the loan market. And I'd like to see this happening more in the loan market, as I think there's, you know, it's a really impactful tool that can be used to kind of get that comfort and sort of, you know, help to make sure that things are not particularly that unintentional greenwashing that Sharga was talking about earlier. And then I guess the second bit for me is promoting the disclosure of the real meaningful details. And one of the markets that I think this is the most kind of challenging thing for is around the sustainability linked loan space. We see lots and lots of companies doing these, particularly in Europe. There are, you know, so many, I've lost count, and I think everybody else has as well, because almost everybody is looking at this now. But a lot of these, you see, you know, company X has, the press release says something like company X has said it has, you know, borrowed in a sustainability linked format, and it's linked to, you know, X and Y, and that's about as much detail as you get. And what we really need to see is we need to see companies giving themselves actually some accountability up front and saying, these are what the metrics that I'm going to be assessed on. These are the targets that I need to reach. And then you develop a bit more kind of accountability and a bit more sort of standard and scrutiny that follows on this. And I think, you know, a regional example that did this really well was Majid Al Futtaim. If you look at the press release for the sustainability linked loan that we helped them structure earlier in the year, you can see they've been very transparent around what the KPIs are, what the targets that are linked to it, and also what are the international standards that they are benchmarking themselves to, obviously where appropriate. So I think that, you know, banks can really promote that disclosure and help to sort of drive that transparency around that bit as well.
Thank you very much, Oliver. And Rodri, last but not least, maybe you can give us a bit of your view, especially in terms of regulations and governance. I remember you told me you have a nice view about that, especially in avoiding greenwashing.
Yeah, thanks, Tarek. I mean, not a huge amount to add. I think, you know, Oliver and Shargil have made some really important comments there around greenwashing. I guess just to underscore this notion that, you know, greenwashing is a genuine concern. If you think about investors as the suppliers of capital to these projects in emerging markets and other developing economies, you know, they will only supply that capital if there is trust in the information provided, that they know that those funds are being put to the stated uses. And greenwashing can erode that trust mechanism. So it's very important that we don't, that greenwashing doesn't become an obstacle to the flow of funds to some of these important projects. So that's very important. In terms of how we address that, we think, you know, standards have a role to play. We've already talked about corporate disclosures and accounting standards, but also in terms of investment product disclosures is an area where we think standards can address potential concerns around greenwashing. We conducted a survey of investment professionals. 78% said that there is a need for improved standards around ESG products to diminish greenwashing. And this is an area that CFA Institute has been investing in itself. We've created our own set of ESG product disclosure standards. They're a voluntary set of standards designed to enable investors, consultants, advisors, distributors better understand, compare and evaluate ESG investment product features. And we think these are consistent with some of the work being done by regulators, including IOSCO, to create a common baseline and set of consistent international standards around product disclosures. So in short, you know, greenwashing, it's a real issue. It's an important issue. We can tackle it through standards, and standards are needed to uphold the trust that is necessary for these transactions to take place and for greenwashing not to obstruct the flow of capital.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to thank you all for joining us today, and special thank you for our panelists for taking the time to speak with us. We talked today about the outcomes of COP26 and what can we take for the next COP. We talked how can we make projects more bankable, and we looked on how we can upskill finance professionals for being more able to work in sustainable projects. And we also talked about the role of capital and how to detect and avoid greenwashing. This web series will be available on Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week YouTube channel in the coming days. A reminder that Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week 2022 is taking place from 15th to 19th of January 2022. If you would like to register and for more information, please visit their website, www.adsw.ae. Have a great holiday season, everyone, and thank you very much.